On August 17, 1945, a submarine surfaced off the coast of Argentina. The war in Europe had been over for 101 days. The atomic bombs had already fallen on Japan, and a German U-boat, fully armed with 10 torpedoes still aboard, was slowly navigating into the harbor at Mar del Plata. It had been at sea for 107 days. It had crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean, and for 66 of those days, it had never once broken the surface. Nobody knew it was coming. The Allies believed this submarine was sitting on the bottom of the North Sea, wrecked off the coast of Norway. They had been told so by the submarine's own crew. 16 men had been put ashore in the dark near Bergen, given rubber rafts and a cover story, and instructed to tell the British that the boat had run aground and sunk. The British believed them. On June 1, 1945, the Admiralty officially notified the United States Navy that U-977 had been lost. The submarine was struck from every active list. The hunt was over before anyone knew there was something to hunt. And then, 2.5 months later, it appeared off Argentina, armed, operational, with a crew of 32 men who had just completed the longest continuous submerged voyage any of them would ever survive. The question that consumed Allied intelligence was simple. Where had it been for 107 days, and what had it delivered before it surrendered? The answer to the first question took decades to confirm. The answer to the second question is still being argued. To understand why 32 men chose to cross the Atlantic in a steel tube rather than surrender, you need to understand what surrender meant in May 1945. The war was lost. Everyone aboard knew it. On May 1st, German radio announced the death of Adolf Hitler. On May 8th, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, DU-Nitz, issued the unconditional surrender order to every German naval unit still operating. Most of the surviving U-boat fleet complied. Submarines surfaced across the Atlantic, hoisted white flags, and sailed to Allied ports. Others chose to scuttle rather than hand their boats to the enemy. A handful of commanders did neither. Heinz Schaefer, SHEAFF, was 24 years old. He had commanded U-977 for less than 6 months. The boat was a Type 7C, the standard workhorse of the German submarine fleet. It had spent nearly 2 years as a training vessel after suffering structural damage in 3 separate ramming incidents during exercises. Schaefer had taken the boat on its first and only combat patrol on May 2nd, departing Kristiansand, Norway, with orders to penetrate the British port of Southampton and sink Allied shipping. For a standard U-boat in the English Channel in 1945, this was a suicide mission. They never got close. Within days, the surrender order came through on the radio. Schaefer's crew heard the broadcast. The message praised the gallantry of the U-boat men over 5 years of war. Then it ended with a directive that left no room for interpretation. Tomorrow we surrender, and from tomorrow you will take your orders from the Allied command. The crew didn't believe it at first. They suspected the Allies had cracked their codes and were transmitting false orders. Dönitz had spent years promising to fight to the last man. Unconditional surrender seemed impossible. When the reality became undeniable, Schaefer did something extraordinary for a military commander in any navy, let alone the rigidly autocratic Kriegsmarine. He put the fate of the submarine to a democratic vote. He assembled the 48 men aboard in the cramped forward torpedo room, the only space large enough to hold them all, and laid out 3 options: surrender and accept captivity, scuttle the boat and become refugees adrift in the North Atlantic, or attempt a crossing to Argentina, where a large German expatriate community offered the possibility of disappearing into civilian life and starting over. He made no attempt to influence the outcome. He told them the risks of each option honestly. Surrender meant prisoner of war camps for an unknown duration. Scuttling meant life rafts in cold water with no guarantee of rescue. Argentina meant months in a submarine with no support, no resupply, and a fuel supply that might not be enough. The votes split along lines that tell you everything about who these men were. 30 voted for Argentina, the youngest men, the ones with the least to go back to and the most to fear from captivity. 2 voted for Spain. Closer, but the Iberian coast was crawling with Allied patrols. And 16 voted to go home, the oldest men aboard. Married petty officers with families waiting in a Germany that was being carved into occupation zones. They could not abandon their wives and children to an uncertain fate, no matter what that fate might include for themselves. Schaffer respected the minority. He turned the boat back toward Norway. In the early hours of May 10th, between 2:30 and 3:30 in the morning, U-977 surfaced near Holsenøy, Holsenøy Island, outside Bergen. 16 men climbed into rubber rafts and paddled toward the Norwegian coast in the dark. One of the 3 large rubber boats was damaged during deployment and had to be abandoned. They also carried 16 individual one-man life rafts as backup. They carried a cover story that Schaffer had prepared. They would tell the British that the submarine had run aground near Bremensia on May 9th and broken apart. They were the sole survivors. The submarine was at the bottom. It took them weeks to reach Bergen and turn themselves in to the British occupation authorities. When they did, the story held. The British were overwhelmed. Hundreds of U-boats were being processed. Thousands of German naval personnel were being catalogued, interrogated, and interned. 16 men from an unremarkable training boat telling a plausible grounding story barely registered. On June 1st, 1945, the British Admiralty officially notified the United States Navy that U-977 had been lost in Norwegian waters due to a grounding incident. The deception was complete. By convincing the Allies that the submarine was destroyed, Schaffer had bought himself the most valuable commodity a fugitive can possess: time. Weeks of unmolested transit across an ocean whose anti-submarine networks were focused on managing a surrender, not hunting a ghost they believed was already dead. The Type 7C was not built for this. It was a medium-range attack submarine designed for operations in the North Atlantic and the approaches to the British Isles. Its operational range on the surface was 8,500 nautical miles at an economical 10 knots. Submerged, it could manage 80 miles at 4 knots before the batteries died. Schaffer had departed Norway with 85 metric tons of diesel fuel. The distance to Argentina was over 7,600 nautical miles. The math was barely possible. Every mile had to be traveled at minimum speed. Every drop of fuel had to be conserved. There was no margin for detours, no reserve for emergencies, no room for error of any kind. And for the first 66 days, according to Schaffer's later account, the submarine never surfaced. The snorkel made this theoretically possible. A retractable mast that allowed the diesel engines to draw air from the surface while the boat remained at periscope depth. The technology worked, but it was crude. In heavy seas, the snorkel head dipped beneath the waves. When this happened, the intake valve slammed shut to prevent flooding. But the diesels kept running for a few seconds after the air supply was cut. They sucked the remaining oxygen from inside the pressure hull. The barometric pressure dropped instantly. Eardrums ruptured. Men doubled over in agony. Then the valve reopened and the pressure equalized with a violent rush of air that was almost as painful as the drop. This happened repeatedly. For weeks, the crew learned to brace for it. They learned to exhale before the valve closed, to grip whatever was nearest, to ride out the pressure drop without screaming. Some of them managed, some didn't. The internal environment of the submarine became unbearable within the first week and continued to deteriorate for the next 8. Diesel exhaust leaked into the living spaces and coated every surface in greasy, toxic soot. The food tasted like engine oil. The bread grew mold. The provisions that had been loaded for a short combat patrol in the English Channel were never meant to sustain 32 men across an ocean. Without sunlight, the crew developed vitamin D deficiency. Skin infections spread through the boat. Sores that would have healed in days on the surface festered for weeks in the damp, sunless interior. The men's skin took on a grey-yellow pallor that wouldn't fade until weeks after they finally saw daylight again. The air recycling systems could not keep up with the carbon dioxide output of 32 men breathing in a sealed steel cylinder. Headaches became constant, concentration degraded, simple tasks took longer. The oxygen content of the air dropped low enough that matches wouldn't light. The waste management systems failed. The combination of unwashed bodies, rotting provisions, battery off-gassing, and backed-up sanitation made the atmosphere inside the boat nearly unbreathable. Early in the voyage, a crew error compounded the misery. Someone left the observation periscope raised during a dive. The mast was damaged beyond repair. The observation periscope was the longer of the two, designed to scan both the surface and the sky for aircraft. Its loss left the crew with only a short reserve periscope designed for night attacks, which could see only what was directly overhead. They were crossing the most heavily patrolled ocean on Earth, effectively blind. The physical toll was staggering. Men lost weight rapidly. Depression set in. The claustrophobia of weeks spent in a space smaller than a city bus, unable to stand fully upright in most compartments, unable to see the sky, unable to breathe clean air, pushed the crew toward a psychological breaking point that Schaefer later admitted came close to being reached. On July 14th, the breaking point was averted. U-977 surfaced off the Cape Verde Islands, near the island of Branco. For 4 hours, the crew swam in the open ocean, stood on the deck in sunlight, and breathed air that did not taste like diesel exhaust. 4 hours. After 66 days submerged, that was the margin between endurance and collapse. They continued south. On July 23rd or 24th, they crossed the equator and held a traditional Neptune line crossing ceremony. A moment of normalcy in a voyage that had abandoned every normal parameter of submarine operations months earlier. The fuel situation governed everything. The engineering officer monitored consumption with an obsessiveness that bordered on religious devotion. Every revolution of the propeller shafts was calculated. High-speed surface running, which consumed exponentially more fuel due to hydrodynamic drag, was forbidden. When the coast of Argentina finally appeared on the horizon, U-977 had approximately 5 tons of diesel remaining, enough for a few days of local operation. The 85 tons they had departed with had carried them 7,644 nautical miles across the Atlantic at speeds that barely exceeded walking pace. The arrival created an immediate diplomatic crisis. Argentina had declared war on the Axis powers only 5 months earlier, in March 1945, under intense American pressure and the threat of severe economic sanctions. The country's neutrality during the war had been a barely concealed alignment with Germany. Deep economic ties, a large German expatriate community, and sympathetic elements within the military government had made Buenos Aires a haven for Axis intelligence and financial operatives throughout the conflict. The rat lines that would later funnel Nazi war criminals to South America were already operational. Adolf Eichmann, the chief architect of the Holocaust, would eventually live openly in Argentina under a false name. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor, would be granted entry. The infrastructure for absorbing fugitives was not theoretical, it was functioning, and into this environment, a fully armed German submarine had just appeared in broad daylight. And this was not the first ghost submarine to appear. 5 weeks earlier, on July 10th, another German U-boat had surrendered at Mar del Plata. U-530, a larger Type 9C long-range submarine commanded by Otto Wermuth, Wehr Ermüht, had arrived under deeply suspicious circumstances. Before entering port, Wermuth's crew had jettisoned the deck gun, dumped all torpedoes overboard, destroyed every logbook and document aboard, and contaminated the remaining fuel with battery acid to render the boat useless. Wermuth refused to explain the voyage. He invoked his status as a prisoner of war and said nothing. The global press exploded. 2 German submarines arriving in Argentina months after the war ended, one with its records destroyed, one that the Allies had believed was sunk. The conspiracy theories wrote themselves. The most persistent theory was that the submarines had transported Adolf Hitler to South America. Tabloid reports claimed the boats had offloaded high-ranking Nazi officials on the Patagonian coast under cover of darkness before surrendering as empty vessels. An Argentine reporter claimed to have seen a provincial police report describing a submarine landing a high-ranking officer and a civilian. A parallel theory held that the submarines carried looted gold, currency, and valuables intended to finance a Fourth Reich in exile. A third, more outlandish theory connected U-977 to a secret Nazi base in Antarctica, built during a 1938 expedition to Queen Maud Land. Schaefer understood exactly what he was walking into, and he did the opposite of what Wermuth had done. U-977 was surrendered in full working condition, 10 torpedoes still aboard, logbooks intact, codebooks intact, cryptographic equipment intact. The fuel consumption records, the navigational plots, the daily position logs, everything Schaefer had was handed over to the Argentine Navy and subsequently to American intelligence. This was not honesty, it was strategy. By preserving the complete paper trail of his voyage, Schaefer made it mathematically provable that U-977 had sailed directly from Norway to Argentina without detours. The fuel consumption matched a direct route at economical speed. There was no surplus fuel in the equation that would have permitted a side trip to Antarctica, to the Brazilian coast, or to any clandestine rendezvous point. 85 tons of diesel, 7,600 miles, 5 tons remaining. The math left no room for a mystery delivery. American and British naval analysts interrogated Schaefer and his crew exhaustively. The logbooks matched the testimonies. The fuel records matched the distances. The navigation plots matched the timeline. And the physical condition of the boat, mechanically ravaged by 107 days of continuous operation, confirmed that no additional range had been squeezed from the engines. The Antarctic theory collapsed on its own physics. June and July, when the submarine was supposedly operating near the ice shelf, represent the depths of the southern hemisphere winter. A Type 7C navigating Antarctic waters in winter was an impossibility that required no intelligence analysis to dismiss. The Brazilian cruiser Bahia, which had been lost with massive casualties in early July, was also ruled out. Forensic naval investigation confirmed the ship was destroyed by a catastrophic internal gunnery accident during an anti-aircraft training exercise. Every conspiracy theory that attached itself to U-977 was dismantled by the evidence that Schaefer himself had preserved by refusing to destroy his records. The Americans took possession of the submarine and sailed it to the United States. The transit was harrowing. The diesels, worn beyond their engineering tolerances by the transatlantic crossing, failed completely in open ocean. The American crew overhauled the German engines at sea and nursed the boat into the Boston Navy Yard on November 13, 1945. The Navy recognized the propaganda value of a captured U-boat. U-977 was cleaned, repaired, and sent on a victory loan tour of the eastern seaboard. The submarine that had terrified Allied shipping lanes was paraded through Albany, Poughkeepsie, Wilmington, Richmond, and Washington, D.C. as a floating advertisement for war bonds. The gray wolves of the Atlantic had been reduced to museum exhibits used to pay off the debts of the nations that had defeated them. By January 1946, the intelligence value had been extracted. U-977 was moored at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and stripped for parts. On November 13, 1946, exactly 1 year after arriving in Boston, the hull was towed into the Atlantic off Cape Cod. The fleet submarine USS Atuli was assigned to sink it. Atuli fired a single torpedo fitted with an experimental magnetic proximity warhead containing 660 pounds of torpex. The warhead detonated beneath the keel. The pressure hull split in 10 seconds. The forward and aft sections jackknifed inward. U-977 plunged to the bottom of the Atlantic, ending the operational history of the submarine that had crossed an ocean to avoid surrender and then been surrendered anyway. Schaefer was released from Allied custody in 1947. He published his memoir in 1952. He titled it U-Boat 977, 66 Days Underwater. The 66-day claim remains contested. American interrogation records from September 1945 note that the submarine executed crash dives on at least 2 occasions during the crossing, once for an aircraft and once for a surface ship. A submarine can only crash dive if it is already on the surface. Allied direction-finding equipment also tracked the boat's radio transmissions late in May, which required raising a mast above the waterline. Schaefer likely exaggerated the continuity of the submerged run. By framing the voyage as an unbroken underwater endurance record, he transformed himself from a fugitive who had defied a surrender order into a legendary mariner who had achieved the impossible. The rebranding worked. The conspiracy theories did not survive the evidence, but the seamanship endured as a story worth telling. 32 men in a steel tube, 85 tons of fuel, 7,600 miles of open ocean, and a destination chosen by democratic vote in the middle of a collapsing war. Whether it was 66 days submerged or something less, the crossing of the Atlantic in a Type 7C with no support, no resupply, and no margin for error remains one of the most remarkable feats of navigation in the history of submarine warfare. The boat is gone, broken in half by an American torpedo off Cape Cod. The crew scattered into civilian lives across 2 continents. The conspiracies faded into the noise of history. What remains is the math. 85 tons of fuel, 5 tons at the end, and an ocean crossed by men who voted on their own fate and then lived with the result for 107 days in a space they could barely breathe in. The sea does not care about politics or propaganda or the myths that men attach to submarines. It cares about fuel and distance and whether the hull holds. U-977's hull held, barely. And that is the only part of the story the ocean remembers.